Ugh.
Our first trek was around the Annapurna Circuit. This trip started with a flight from Kathmandu to Pokhara to meet Tuleram, the Nepalese man who would serve as our porter, guide, and friend for the next 26 days. Our trip began with a bus ride from Pokhara to Besisahar, a trip that would turn out to be the bus ride from hell. It took 10 hours to travel the 60-mile distance in heat and humidity, both approaching 100. Our on-tape narration describes some of the adventures along the way.
Okay, we're crossing now. There's no bridge here, it's just a rock pile. Okay, we are stopping here to unload some passengers so we can negotiate the mud hole on this road here. Looks like a rather large one.
Our bus just had a blowout, so we're in the process of repairing it. Let me show you what's going on. That's the spare tire. Okay, I think we're at the end of our bus journey. Couldn't go any more further if we wanted to. Fortunately, though, the stuck truck was on the outskirts of Besisahar, and it was only a short hike to a lodge for the night. Okay, we're on our way. We're leaving Basisar, headed for the mountains. Okay, our first stream crossing, we're taking off shoes. Our first day of hiking was through beautiful, lush, and rolling green countryside, most of which was cultivated in rice. The hiking was difficult, not because of the ups and downs, but due to the intense humidity and heat. This first day of trekking changed my image of Nepal immediately. I'd always thought of Nepal as a country of mountains, but I came to realize from day one on the trail that Nepal is a country of water as well as mountains. On this day, and on all subsequent days, we would experience the power and importance of Nepal's rivers and waterfalls. As we made our way from Besisahar at 2,600 feet toward the 17,764-foot Thorongla Pass, we would follow the valley formed by the incredible Marjandi River, and after crossing the pass, we would trek down the beautiful Kali Gandaki River valley.
Okay, Barbara's crossing the log bridge.
The trail around Annapurna would require multiple crossings of these rivers and their tributaries on a variety of bridges. Some as simple as a log. Some beautiful cantilevered structures. Some modern steel cable bridges. And many one-of-a-kind structures. As we reflect back on the 160 miles of hiking around the Annapurna Circuit, we remember 4 days as being particularly difficult. The first day, due to the heat and humidity, and the second day, Well, the second day not only had the heat and humidity, but also the steep ups and downs of the foothills. Although we only netted about 1,500 feet elevation gain this day, we probably did triple that amount, and our walking sticks were worth their weight in gold. But the sweat and sore muscles were worth it, because the trekking enabled us to walk through many Gurung villages and observe the culture of these mountain people. We found the Nepalese to be very friendly, with virtually everyone we met on the trail greeting us with the traditional Namaste, which means, I salute the God within you. Day 3 was a transition day, as our gain in altitude reduced the trauma of hiking in the heat and humidity. And this was also the first day we caught a glimpse of the high peaks in the Annapurna Range. Dave was so excited, he did a little skip for joy. Most of our hiking this day continued to be very uphill, through an ever-narrowing canyon surrounded by steep, steep mountains. Finally, at the end of the day, we reached a flat-bottomed valley and the quaint little village of Tal. In hindsight, we regret that we didn't stay an extra day in this beautiful location, enjoying the charm of this village and its people. After leaving Tal, we began to see signs of the Tibetan culture as we passed through villages. The houses were now made of stone, and prayer wheels marked the entrance to a town. Sometimes these Buddhist religious shrines were very humble and worn, and sometimes the prayer wheels were elegantly tooled. We learned to walk around them clockwise, and, like the local people, we turned the prayer wheels as we passed. We were now hiking at an elevation of around 7,000 feet, and in an area that was particularly subjected to landslides. Throughout our trekking experience, we would see hundreds of landslides and hear stories about how villages had been wiped out by these massive movements of land. But for the most part, the landslides were just an inconvenience. Out of necessity, a new trail would quickly be established across the rubble, so that communication and commerce between villages was renewed. But some of our most challenging hiking was across the unstable rock in the slide areas. At times the trail was no wider than the width of your boot, and it was a long ways down the mountain.
Okay, this is Lower Pisang. Today is Sunday, October 11th, start of a new day, and we're on our way to Manang.
On our way to Manang, that meant we'd be in the high country, the kind of mountainous area that was Dave's and my favorite. Dry, cool, and beautifully scenic. But this day in the high country would be etched in our minds forever. There's something magic about walking amongst beautiful snow-capped peaks to the accompaniment of donkey bells. Soon we would reach Manang, the largest village in this wide, dry, arid high country, which is spectacularly surrounded by Himalayan peaks. Lamjung, Annapurna 2, Annapurna 4, Annapurna 3, Gangapurna, Glacial Dome, and Tilicho. The inhabitants of Manang have lived here for centuries, eking out a living as traders and farmers. The village itself consists of approximately 200 flat-roofed houses, which are tightly packed together with prayer flags on long poles above them. When we were there, the houses were readied for winter, with piles of hay stacked on the roofs to be fed to the animals.
This is the main street in Manang.
By the time we reached Manang, we'd been on the trail 10 days, and it was time for some rest. I'd been suffering from a terrible cold since the very first day of the trip, and was concerned about making it over the pass if I couldn't get to feeling better. In addition, we needed a day to acclimatize to the altitude, which was now almost 12,000 feet.
People still are trying to write it off as well. I was in the sun, my sunglasses on.
On our first layover day in Manang, we attended a lecture on altitude sickness prevention, which was presented by the Himalayan Rescue Association. During the peak trekking seasons, volunteer doctors from the United States and Canada staff 2 clinics in the heavily trekked high-altitude areas, and one of them is in Manang. As a result of the educational efforts of this organization, deaths resulting from altitude sickness have dropped from 40 trekkers in 1,000 to just 1 trekker in 1,000. On our second layover day, we hiked up the mountain behind Manang to a hermitage, where a Buddhist Lama conducts worship services for the trekkers. These pujas, as they are locally called, consist of prayers and rituals to invoke the blessing of the gods in helping the trekkers over the Thorongla Pass. One by one, Tuleram, Dave, and I were stepped through a ritual which would supposedly ensure our success in climbing over the 17,760-foot pass. The Lama was a jovial, people-loving, 82-year-old man with a twinkle in his eye and a rich, deep laugh, and we really had a lot of fun with him and his lady friend. As we made our way back down the mountain for our last night in Manang, we felt invigorated and ready to tackle the difficult hiking that would take us over the pass. Blessed by the local Lama, rested, and inspired by the incredible beauty surrounding us, how could we not succeed in getting over Thorongla? As we left Manang, it was hard not to walk backwards, because behind us were spectacular views of Annapurna 3 and Gangapurna. Fortunately, though, this leg of the trip required frequent stops because of the steep altitude gain. But these stops also gave us a chance to etch in our memory these amazing Himalayan panoramas, including the exquisite ice formations gracing Annapurna 3. After Manang, we said goodbye to village life, because we were now attaining an altitude above permanent settlements. There would be seasonal accommodations for us trekkers, but nothing else. As the day progressed, our hiking was through a high alpine meadow, reminiscent of the high Sierras, and at an altitude of over 13,500 feet. By mid-afternoon we stopped at a newly built tea house. The afternoon sun was comfortable, but by 4 o'clock we were wearing everything we owned, and by 6:30 we had retreated into our down sleeping bags for warmth. The next day we hiked to Fede, which at 14,600 feet was the highest altitude we would sleep at, and which was also the base camp for the Thorongla Pass. It was a short day of hiking, but the trails were difficult due to scree and talus on the steep slopes. Our surroundings were also becoming more and more desolate as vegetation disappeared. As we hung out in the patio of our austere lodge with the other trekkers, we were all feeling pretty anxious, because we knew if we didn't make it over the pass, we would have to backtrack over the same trail we'd spent the last 2 weeks climbing. We'd seen disheartened trekkers on their return, and we didn't want to be one of them. We surveyed our route from a distance. We knew it was going to be a difficult day. 3,000 feet elevation gain to an altitude of 17,764 feet, followed by a drop of 5,500 feet. We also knew there was only one small tea house on the summit where you could get a cup of hot soup. We therefore ate heartily that night, filling our bellies with as much carbohydrate as possible, and consuming large bowls of garlic soup, which the Nepalese believe is a good antidote to altitude sickness. The helpful kitchen staff also prepared boiled potatoes, hard-boiled eggs, and Tibetan bread that we could pack away as lunch for the next day. The next morning we were up at 3:30, and by 4, we and many of the other trekkers were already finding our way up the pass by flashlight. When it began to get light out around 6:30, we'd already covered some of the steepest stretches of the trail. Fortunately, we were blessed with good weather, though 2 days later it snowed and Thorong Law was impassable. But despite the good conditions, it was tough going at this altitude, and we would look back on this day as the hardest of all. 7.5 hours after leaving Fedi, we reached the top and realized that we had set a new international record. It had taken us longer to make this climb than anyone else, at least anyone else we knew. But since we were approximately 30 years older than most everyone else we knew on the trail, we didn't feel too bad. At least we'd made it to the top, and thus, like the bear that went over the mountain, we'd have a chance to see what we could see on the other side. Once on top, we took the obligatory pictures, had a badly needed bowl of soup and some tea, and hurried to get out of the wind and the cold. Besides, we still had a 5,500-foot elevation loss to accomplish before we could sleep. We didn't video much on the way down. We were much too focused on getting a footing on the gravelly trail and concerned about the time. In many ways, the descent was far more difficult than the climb, especially because we were tired. Around 5:30, we finally reached a rustic little tea house, and before they could deliver the Coca-Cola we had ordered, Dave was asleep on the table. It was obvious that we needed to quit, and the gracious Tibetan family that ran the tea house obliged us. By 6 o'clock we were sound asleep on a rock ledge bed, but 12 hours later we were like new and ready to hike again. The next day was a planned layover day, so we only had an hour's walk to complete the trek to Muktinath that we'd been too tired to finish the day before. Muktinath's claim to fame is twofold. First of all, it's a place of celebration for the trekkers who have made it over Thorong Law. Everyone takes a layover day here to bathe and do laundry, and many of the lodges even have solar-heated water if you get in line before it runs out. Dave was not so lucky. He did his laundry and bathing in the street at the central water faucet, while I enjoyed watching the children at their various forms of play. Then we explored Muktinath's walled temple complex, its second claim to fame. For centuries, both Hindus and Buddhists have made pilgrimages here, and Hindus consider this site the second most holy place in Nepal. The courtyard contains 108 brass water spouts, and to bathe in the freezing water is said to bring salvation to Hindus. We left Muktinath in the clouds and pouring rain, the only rainy day on the entire trek. It rained hard as we trudged our way through the desolate countryside. Fortunately, though, we were well equipped with good rain pants and ponchos, so we were happy trekkers despite the dismal weather. From an altitude of 12,500 feet in Muktinath, we were headed down toward the Kaligandaki Valley, and the little medieval hamlet of Kagbeni. At 9,000 feet elevation, our lungs were finding it easier to breathe, and vegetation was once again becoming part of the landscape.
Namaste!
In the rain we explored Kagbeni, a fascinating rabbit warren of crumbling mud brick houses that provided living quarters for people above and cattle below. In the center of the village was a ruined palace, a reminder of the ancient kingdoms that predated the unification of Nepal. From Kagbeni we turned south, following the multi-streamed, half-mile-wide Kali Gandaki River. This route would take us through the district headquarters at Jomasan and on to the quaint city of Marfa, where we would spend the next night. The trail was an easy one, and a busy one, with many trekkers, Hindu pilgrims, and Tibetan horsemen. Lunch in Jomasan was particularly fun. Our guide Tuleram loved to cook, and often the tea house owners would invite him into the kitchen to participate in the food preparations. I loved to follow him, to watch all the activity. On this day, Tuleram took charge of the meal preparation, and I helped with the vegetable chopping and garlic peeling. Pretty soon a delicious spring roll had been created and ceremoniously brought to our table. By the time lunch was over, the winds were howling as we made our way to Marfa. The rains were gone, but there were enough clouds on the horizon that most of the surrounding mountains were obscure. When we arrived in Marfa, we learned that a festival of dance was in full swing. We had time to check into our hotel and grab a bite of dinner before the evening procession began. It was too dark for the camera to capture good video, but the music is so visceral you can probably fill in the missing visual details. We loved Marfa. Everything about it showed pride. The whitewashed walls, underground sewer system, slate sidewalks, neatly stacked wood piles on the roofs, and its cleanliness in general. We also loved the food available here, especially the Dutch apple pie, which was out of this world. As we descended from Marfa, village life became more prevalent because we were now below 9,000 feet. Our trail continued to follow the Gandaki River and the quaint villages along its banks, which at one time were important stops on the salt for grain trading route between Nepal and Tibet. When we arrived in Larjung, we took another layover day. Dave used the day to do a side trip with Tuleram up the Dalagiri ice falls, a strenuous sunrise to sunset climb. I, on the other hand, opted to be lazy. I stayed behind to do laundry and to explore the culture of this little village. As it turned out, Rupa, the owner of our tea house, and her sister Popa, who helped her manage it, were both delightful ladies, and I had a wonderful time learning from them about their family and life in Larjung. Sisters, yes? Yes. Yeah. Any more? Any more sisters?
Yeah, no.
You have more sisters?
I have many sisters.
Many sisters?
Yeah, 4 sisters.
4 sisters.
Yeah.
In the afternoon, a group of Tibetan sheep herders came through the village, and Rupa's husband bought a sheep, which he slaughtered when we got back to the tea house. That night, Rupa prepared mutton for dinner. It was only the second time we'd eaten meat in 3 weeks.
Yes.
Is that a special treat?
Yes.
Yes. Next morning, Rupa sent us off down the river laden with gifts. She and her family had been wonderful to us, and we hated to say goodbye. On this day, like many others, children stopped us to examine our gear and ask for a pencil or candy. Dave in particular was a curiosity because of the solar panel he wore to charge our video camera batteries.
And all these wires connect together here, and here, here.
Based on the reading we'd done before going to Nepal, we made a conscious decision not to bring candy or pencils to give the children, and thus encourage begging behavior. Instead, I would try and interact with the children by playing cat's cradle, or showing them how to make an origami bird. In lieu of gifts for the children, we brought laminated world maps as gifts for the village schools that we passed. We had been hiking along the Kaligandaki River for 3 days now, and the topography was changing dramatically. We were losing altitude rapidly as we dropped into the bottom of the deepest valley in the world, along some very treacherous trails. Pine forests were replacing the arid landscapes of the high altitudes. And the sleepy, multi-streamed river we'd followed initially had now become a raging torrent of a river at the bottom of this gorge. We would follow the Kaligandaki River for another 2 days to the little riverside village of Tatopani. We'd now dropped to an elevation of 3,900 feet and were surrounded by hot springs and subtropical gardens. We passed through Tatopani midday, but we could have used one of its hot springs that evening, because we had some tough climbing just beyond Tatopani around a massive landslide that had occurred just a few weeks earlier. The landslide was so enormous it had actually changed the course of the Kaligandaki River. Once past the landslide, we crossed the Kaligandaki for one last time and turned east to make our way back toward Pokhara. 6,000 steps awaited us on the next section of the trail, a long, hot ascent to Gorapani, which was in the foothills of the Himalayas at an elevation of 9,000 feet. This challenging climb underscored the admiration we'd developed for the Nepalese porters we'd observed throughout our trek. Often carrying 100-pound loads of sometimes awkward proportions, these incredible men and women weathered harsh conditions as they supported trekker groups or brought supplies to remote villages. Yet there was almost always a greeting of namaste as we passed on the trail. After a day and a half of climbing, we reached Gorapani, which is a prime destination for many short 4 to 5 day treks. It is the dawn pilgrimage to the summit of Poon Hill that is the attraction. Once again we were up before daylight and hiking by flashlight with the hopes of seeing a spectacular Himalayan panorama under early morning lighting conditions. When we reached the summit of Poon Hill, we found a bench to sit on and waited in the cold for daybreak to bring color to the Himalayan peaks surrounding us. Clouds prevented a picture-perfect panorama, but the changing light conditions were breathtaking in any event. After a hearty breakfast in Gorapani, we made our way through a dense forest of rhododendron trees. Perhaps it was the 6,000 steps of the preceding day, or the early morning climb up Poon Hill, but whatever it was, this day turned out to be my most difficult. Despite the fun of sighting water buffalo wallowing in mud holes, or langur monkeys scampering in the trees, this day was a tough one. Our knees suffered terribly trying to maneuver the slippery trails and struggling to step around the giant rhododendron tree roots. It was steep up and down climbing all day, an effort that sent me straight to bed with no energy for eating dinner. But once again, a good night's sleep restored us, and the next morning we enjoyed a leisurely breakfast in the gardens of our lodge, looking out at the surrounding Annapurna peaks. Our trek was now almost over. We had only 2 days left, but those last 2 days would be through some of the most charming countryside yet. Machu Picchu, or Fishtail as it is commonly called, graced the horizon much of the time, and the beautifully terraced fields were alive with activity as villagers brought in the last crops of the season before winter arrived. Our last night on the trail was spent in Gondruk, a charming Gurung village of about 7,000 people. This village and others in the area are home to the Gurkha soldiers, whose military successes in the British Army during World War II are legendary. A significantly more prosperous village than most, we later learned that this affluence was primarily the result of the handsome pensions paid to these former Gurkhas by the British government. The next day we completed the Annapurna Circuit loop. After 26 days on the trail, we returned to Pokhara and a very welcome hot bath. That evening we celebrated our successful trek at the home of Tuleram and his family. After a few snapshots, Dave followed Tuleram to the kitchen for a doll-bot cooking lesson, and I played with the children. Following dinner, by the light of a 5-watt light bulb, we taught the children how to make origami birds and windmills. It was a fitting ending to our trip, filled with laughter and good fellowship. The next day we got our last views of the Annapurnas, this time from the air. It had been hard work hiking those 160 miles around the Annapurna Circuit, but we would cherish every minute of the journey. This trek, and the one we would begin in another 10 days to the Everest base camp area, had been planned as a 30th wedding anniversary celebration. We reflected on how fortunate we were to have such a memory.